The seal stamp weighed exactly 217 grams, and I had pressed it into warm wax 18,412 times across my 7 years of service aboard Bastion Station Tertius Majoris. The weight never changed. The wax always smelled of sanctified tallow and rendered bone meal. The pressure required to produce a clean impression was consistent, 3 seconds of steady downward force, applied with the heel of the palm, never the fingers. Fingers trembled. The palm was doctrine made flesh. I stood before the final data slate of the resupply audit, the incense burner hissing softly to my left, filling the sanctified verification chamber with smoke that tasted of myrrh and something faintly metallic. The slate displayed caloric projections for the next standard Terran month, 3,800,000 nutrient blocks allocated across 14 subsector garrison points, each block representing 4,000 calories of sanctioned sustenance. Each calorie accounted for in triplicate across parchment, data core, and Vox record. The numbers aligned. The shipping manifests bore the correct liturgical stamps. The cargo coffins waited in the adjacent loading bay, sealed and blessed, ready for void transit. The ritual demanded I recite the litany of reclamation before applying the final seal. My voice emerged steady, shaped by repetition into something that no longer felt entirely mine. In His name, nothing is wasted. In His service, all matter returns, from flesh to sustenance, from loss to continuation, the Emperor provides through our obedience. The words filled the chamber, absorbed by stone walls carved with nutritional tables that dated back 6,000 years. Every scripter who had stood in this chamber had spoken these words. Every seal they had pressed had authorized shipments identical to mine. The continuity was its own form of comfort. I lifted the seal stamp, felt its familiar weight settle into my palm, and positioned it above the final authentication mark. The wax pooled crimson in the depression, still soft, waiting, 3 seconds. Steady pressure. The Aquila imprint emerged perfect, wings spread, talons gripping a scroll that bore the Departamento Munitorum's efficiency maxim in High Gothic, nil perditum, nothing lost. The seal cooled almost instantly, binding the ledger closed. Shipment authorization was now irrevocable. The nutrient blocks would leave the station within 6 hours, distributed across the subsector according to priority classifications I had verified but not determined. My role ended here, at this table, with this stamp, in this smoke. The first discrepancy had appeared 4 hours earlier, during the pre-blessing inspection of the cargo coffins themselves. Protocol required visual confirmation that the sealed containers matched the manifest descriptions, dimensions, weight, purity seals, handling classifications. I had walked the length of the loading bay with a senior adept named Horvath, an emaciated man whose face had long ago settled into an expression of permanent acceptance. He carried the inspection slate. I carried the verification stylus. Behind us, servitors waited motionless, their augmetic limbs poised to begin loading operations the moment we completed our duty. The coffins were standard Munitorum design, reinforced plasteel stamped with the Aquila, each one 3 meters long and sealed with wax and purity chains. The manifest identified them as containing processed remains from Compliance Action 73, a planetary pacification operation in the neighboring subsector that had concluded 9 months prior. Casualty estimates for that action listed 14,700 Imperial citizens killed in the initial pacification, with an additional 8,200 deaths during the subsequent loyalty verification sweeps. The reclamation yield from that action should have produced approximately 68,000 nutrient blocks, accounting for processing loss and skeletal material reserved for servo skull manufacture. The manifest listed 62,000 blocks. The discrepancy was within acceptable variance. Processing facilities never achieved perfect yield, but the weight readings from the cargo scales did not match the expected mass. Each coffin registered heavier than it should have, by margins that accumulated across all 47 containers into a surplus of approximately 4 metric tons. I had pointed to the figures on the inspection slate without speaking. Horvath had glanced at them, then at me, then at the nearest coffin. His expression had not changed. "Seal integrity is maintained," he had said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had recited this line before. "Purity codes are valid. Weight variance falls within moisture retention parameters." Moisture retention. The phrase had settled into my mind with a weight of its own. Processed nutrient blocks were desiccated by design, shelf-stable for decades when properly sealed. Moisture retention implied improper processing. Horvath's explanation should not have resolved the discrepancy. But he had already moved to the next coffin, running his Auspex wand across the purity seals, logging compliance without pause. I had followed. The inspection continued. At the 14th coffin, Horvath had stopped and made a notation. "This one requires secondary verification," he had said. "The seal wax is cracked." The crack was microscopic, barely visible even under direct lumen light, but protocol was absolute. A compromised seal meant potential contamination. I had requisitioned a servitor with cutting tools, while Horvath consulted the breach management liturgy, reading from a small brass-bound book he kept chained to his belt. The servitor had sliced through the purity chains with efficient precision, then levered open the coffin lid with a pneumatic hiss. The smell had emerged first. Not rot, not decay. Something sharper, chemical, overlaid with a sweetness that reminded me of Medicae disinfectant. Inside the coffin, nutrient blocks were stacked in precise rows, each block wrapped in wax paper and stamped with processing dates and caloric content. The blocks nearest the lid bore the expected uniform gray-brown color of standard reclaimed protein, but deeper in the stack, one block's wrapping had torn. I had seen the edge of something that was not uniform, a patch of fabric, dark blue, partially dissolved but still recognizable as textile rather than organic matter. Horvath had reached past me, removed the torn block, and set it aside on the loading bay floor. Beneath it, another block showed a protrusion, something white and hard pressing against the wax paper. The shape was unmistakable, a tooth, human, adult. The bicuspid still intact, root exposed where the gum tissue had been chemically stripped away. Horvath had lifted that block as well, placed it beside the first. Then he had closed the coffin, resealed it with fresh wax from a heating stylus he carried for this purpose, and made a notation on his slate. "In complete dissolution," he had said, "processing facility error. Does not compromise nutritional content. Blocks are viable for distribution." He had recited a brief corrective blessing, 3 lines from the Catechism of Reclamation that I had heard during my initial scripture training 7 years prior. "The Emperor's mercy transforms loss into service. The flesh that fails him still nourishes his armies. From death, sustenance. From sacrifice, continuation." I had marked compliance on my verification slate. Horvath had signaled the servitors to prepare the coffin for loading. The 2 damaged blocks remained on the floor, set aside for reprocessing. The tooth gleamed under the lumen strips. I had stared at it longer than necessary, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I understood. Processing facilities rendered organic matter through chemical dissolution and thermal breakdown. The result was a protein paste that was then compressed, fortified with synthesized vitamins, and molded into standard blocks. Bone fragments were separated before molding. Teeth, especially enamel, resisted processing and was always removed during initial breakdown. Its presence meant the block had been created from material that had bypassed standard procedure. Or standard procedure included pathways I had not been briefed on. Horvath had walked back toward me, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous loading bay. "The ritual concludes in 1 hour, he had said. "Ensure the blessing seals are applied before transit window closure." I had nodded. We had returned to the verification chamber. The inspection was complete. The discrepancies had been documented and resolved through invocation. The coffins were cleared for shipment. Now, standing before the sealed ledger with the stamp still warm in my palm, I felt the same sensation that had emerged when I had seen the tooth. Not quite doubt, not quite fear. Something quieter and more insidious, like the moment before realizing you have been walking in the wrong direction for hours and the path behind you has vanished. The door to the verification chamber opened. Adept Tertius Yana entered, carrying the shipment authorization parchment that would accompany the cargo coffins to their destinations. She was younger than me by perhaps 3 years, her face still carrying enough flesh to show expression. She set the parchment on the table beside the ledger and bowed her head briefly. "The loading servitors await your release command," she said. I lifted the sealed ledger and placed it into the brass transport case that would carry it to the Munitorum archives. The case locked with a soft click. "Authorization granted," I said. "Transit window closure in 5 hours, 43 minutes. The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects," Yana repeated, taking the case. She left without additional words. The chamber returned to silence, broken only by the hiss of the incense burner. I remained standing at the table, staring at the empty space where the ledger had been. The ritual was complete. The shipment would depart. 14 subsector garrisons would receive their allocated nutrient supply. Soldiers would consume the blocks with morning prayers, their bodies sustained by matter reclaimed from the dead and returned to purpose through doctrine. Except some of that matter had not been dead when it entered processing. The thought arrived fully formed, too clear to dismiss. The weight discrepancies, the incomplete dissolution, the fabric fragment and the tooth. Processing facilities operated under strict biological protocols. Cadavers were catalogued upon arrival, verified against casualty lists, purified through prayer, then rendered down into component nutrients. The system functioned because death preceded processing. The boundary was absolute. Unless it was not. I extinguished the incense burner and left the verification chamber, sealing the door behind me. The corridor outside was narrow and cold, lit by intermittent lumen strips that cast shadows in rhythmic intervals. My quarters were 7 sections away, through passages that descended deeper into the station's habitation rings. I walked without hurrying, passing other station personnel scribes, Medicae orderlies, maintenance servitors all, moving through their assigned duties with the same measured pace that governed every action aboard Bastion Station Tertius Majoris. The station had been constructed during the Great Crusade, carved from a massive asteroid in what was now the subsector frontier. Its purpose had always been logistical, to serve as a resupply nexus for military operations across 17 neighboring systems. 800,000 souls lived aboard the station, their lives dedicated to ensuring that weapons, ammunition, fuel, and food reached the Emperor's armies without interruption. We were functionaries, not soldiers. Our obedience was expressed through accuracy, not valor. I had been assigned to the Nutri-Scriptor division upon completing my scholar training. The division maintained all nutritional supply records for the subsector, tracking caloric output from reclamation facilities, managing distribution allocations, and ensuring that no wastage occurred within the supply chain. The work was exacting and repetitive, conducted in silence within climate-controlled archive chambers, where the air smelled of parchment and machine oil. The belief that had sustained me through 7 years of service was simple. Efficiency honored the Emperor. Every calorie preserved meant another hour of service, another battle fought, another world brought into compliance. Hunger was heresy, waste was sin. The Imperium endured because nothing was squandered, because even death returned to usefulness through proper procedure. That belief had never required me to question where the bodies came from. Casualty lists arrived from across the subsector: combat deaths, plague victims, workplace accidents, failed pilgrims who perished during transit. The numbers were abstracted, cleansed of identity through bureaucratic necessity. Names became figures, lives became tonnage. The transformation felt appropriate because doctrine said it was. I reached my quarters and entered, sealing the door behind me. The chamber was 4 meters square, furnished with a cot, a small desk, a storage locker, and a devotional alcove containing a brass aquila mounted above a shelf of prayer candles. I lit one candle, knelt before the alcove, and recited the evening prayer of gratitude. The words came automatically, shaped by years of repetition into something that no longer required conscious thought. But tonight, the prayer felt hollow. The tooth remained in my mind, impossibly clear, its enamel reflecting lumen light. A tooth that should not have survived processing. A tooth that suggested the body it came from had been insufficiently prepared, or that preparation standards were different than I had been taught. I finished the prayer and extinguished the candle. Sleep would not come easily. I lay on the cot, staring at the corroded ceiling panels, and tried to calculate how long it would take for the shipment to reach its first destination. 3 days, perhaps. The garrison troops would break open the coffins, distribute the blocks according to rank and duty assignment, and consume them without question. They would taste iron and salt. They would feel sustained. They would continue fighting. And somewhere in their bodies, fragments of whoever had become those blocks would persist. Cloth fibers embedded in protein matrices. Bone splinters too small to detect. Teeth ground fine enough to pass through digestive systems but not fine enough to erase entirely. I closed my eyes. The incense smell clung to my uniform, a reminder that the ritual had concluded correctly. The seal was pressed. The shipment was authorized. My duty was complete. But completion no longer felt like resolution. The station's night cycle arrived with a dimming of the lumen strips and a shift in the ambient temperature. Cold crept through the ventilation systems, a deliberate discomfort meant to encourage rest while conserving energy. I pulled the thin thermal blanket over myself and forced my breathing into the rhythm taught during scholar meditation exercises. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. The tooth gleamed in the darkness behind my eyelids. I did not sleep. The shift chime woke me at the 5th hour, a resonant brass tone that echoed through the station's hab sections. I rose, performed the morning ablutions, dressed in clean scriptor robes, and made my way to the Nutri-Scriptor division offices. The corridors were already filled with personnel moving toward their assigned duties, faces blank with the practiced emptiness that came from years of repetitive labor. The division occupied an entire section of the station's mid-spine, a warren of archive chambers and administrative alcoves connected by passages barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. I reported to my assigned desk, activated my data slate, and began the day's primary task: processing intake notifications from the subsector's 7 active reclamation facilities. The notifications arrived as standardized forms, each one listing the facility name, the source of organic material, the casualty count, and the expected yield in processed blocks. I verified that each facility's reported output matched projected efficiency rates, flagged any discrepancies above 2% variance, and logged compliance in the central archive system. Today's intake list contained 43 notifications. Facility Sigma 7 reported receiving 870 cadavers from a mining accident on Hive World Voranthus. Expected yield, 34,800 blocks. Facility Omicron 2 reported receiving 1,200 plague victims from Agricultural World Kellis IV. Expected yield, 48,000 blocks. The numbers scrolled past, each line identical in format, distinguished only by the specific figures and location codes. At the 14th notification, my hand paused above the verification stylus. Facility Delta 9 reported receiving 612 cadavers from Population Adjustment, Bastion Station Tertius Majoris, Hab Ring Epsilon. Expected yield, 24,480 blocks. Population Adjustment. The term was unfamiliar. I accessed the doctrinal glossary maintained in the division's archive system, searching for the phrase. The glossary contained 87,000 entries, each one defining terminology used in Munitorum nutritional operations. Population adjustment was not among them. I flagged the notification for senior review and continued processing. The remaining notifications passed without incident. By the midday prayer chime, I had completed verification of all 43 intakes and submitted the day's logs to Adept Quartus Renning, my immediate superior. Renning occupied a desk 3 stations away from mine, positioned beneath a mural that depicted the Emperor standing above heaps of reclaimed grain. He was 68 standard years old, with skin that had gone translucent from decades of archive work. He reviewed my submission without looking up, his stylus moving across the data slate in precise increments. After 3 minutes, he spoke. "Your flag on notification 14 has been reviewed and dismissed. The terminology is correct." I waited for additional explanation. None came. Renning returned the slate to me. The flag removed. The notification marked as verified. "Continue with afternoon allocations," he said. I took the slate back to my desk. The afternoon's work involved calculating distribution requirements for 3 upcoming Crusade fleet deployments, each fleet requiring between 2 and 4 million nutrient blocks depending on campaign duration estimates. The calculations were complex but formulaic, demanding attention without requiring interpretation. But the phrase remained lodged in my thoughts. Population adjustment. Not casualty collection, not compliance action fatalities. Adjustment implied something deliberate, a process rather than a consequence. I accessed the facility intake archives, searching for previous uses of the term. 7 previous notifications over the past 18 months had used identical language. All 7 originated from Bastion Station Tertius Majoris. All 7 listed sources from various Habrings aboard the station itself. The total count across all 7 notifications was 4,320 individuals. 4,000 people from this station, reclaimed and processed into nutrient blocks. The station's population was stable at 800,000. Deaths occurred regularly, accidents, illness, old age, and those deaths were processed according to standard procedure. But 4,000 deaths over 18 months exceeded normal mortality rates by a significant margin. Unless the population was being actively reduced through some mechanism I had not been informed of. I closed the archive query and returned to the allocation calculations. My hands trembled slightly as I entered figures into the slate. The tremor was unprofessional, a sign of insufficient discipline. I stopped, placed the stylus on the desk, and performed the calming breath cycle. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. The numbers stabilized. I resumed work. At the end of shift, Renning summoned me to his desk. He did not look up from his own slate as he spoke. "You have been reassigned to intake observation duties, effective next shift cycle. Report to processing sub-level Theta at the 3rd hour. Senior Adept Horvath will provide operational briefing." Reassignment was not uncommon. Scribes were rotated through different divisions to maintain comprehensive understanding of supply chain operations. But intake observation was typically reserved for senior personnel, those with at least 12 years of service. My 7 years made me junior for the role. "Acknowledged," I said. Renning made a notation on his slate. "The reassignment is developmental. Your verification accuracy is exemplary. Observation experience will prepare you for advancement to Adept Tertius within 5 years. The Emperor rewards diligence." "The Emperor protects," I responded automatically. Renning dismissed me with a gesture. I returned to my desk, collected my personal effects, and left the division offices. The corridors seemed narrower than usual, the lumen strips dimmer. I descended toward the Habrings, passing through multiple security checkpoints where servitors scanned my identification chip and verified my authorization to traverse restricted sections. Habring Epsilon was located on the station's lower tiers, 4 kilometers beneath the command spire. I had never entered the ring before. My duties kept me in the administrative sections, where temperature and atmospheric composition were maintained at optimal levels. As I descended, the air grew warmer and more humid, carrying smells of organic waste and industrial lubricant. The ring's entrance was guarded by 2 Munitorum enforcers, their shotguns held at ready positions. They scanned my chip and waved me through without comment. Beyond the checkpoint, the architecture changed. The passages were wider, designed to accommodate large groups moving in formation. The walls were bare plasteel, undecorated, marked only by directional arrows and section numbers stenciled in faded paint. I followed the arrows toward the communal hab blocks, passing through an open plaza where hundreds of station workers gathered around distribution kiosks. The workers wore identical grey coveralls, their faces uniformly gaunt, their movements slow with fatigue. A voxcaster mounted on a central pillar broadcast a liturgical recitation, the words echoing across the plaza, "In labor we serve, in service we endure. The Emperor's will sustains all." A distribution kiosk dispensed ration blocks to a line of workers. Each worker stepped forward, scanned their identification chip, received a single wrapped block, and moved on. The line never shortened. As one worker departed, another took their place, the cycle maintained through constant replacement. I purchased a ration block from a kiosk reserved for administrative personnel. The block was heavier than expected, wrapped in wax paper stamped with nutritional data. I unwrapped it partially and examined the surface. Grey, brown, dense, slightly oily, the smell was faintly metallic. I bit into it. The taste was iron and salt, with an underlying bitterness that required effort to swallow. The texture was fibrous, requiring prolonged chewing before breaking down enough to ingest. Particles stuck between my teeth. I chewed slowly, standing at the edge of the plaza, watching the distribution line continue its endless cycle. A worker collapsed 3 positions back from the kiosk. The man crumpled without sound, his body striking the plasteel floor with a dull impact. The workers around him did not react. The line continued moving. 2 enforcers approached, lifted the unconscious man by his arms, and dragged him toward a side passage marked with a red stripe. The man's feet scraped against the floor, leaving faint tracks in the accumulated grime. I swallowed the last of the ration block and disposed of the wrapper in a nearby waste receptacle. The block sat heavy in my stomach, generating warmth that spread through my chest. Nourishment, the Emperor's provision through reclamation and redistribution, except the man being dragged away would become part of that provision. Population adjustment. The phrase now carried concrete meaning. Inefficiency was being corrected through removal. The weak, the ill, the unproductive converted back into the system that had sustained them, their bodies becoming fuel for those who remained capable of service. The plaza's voxcaster continued its liturgical broadcast. I listened to the words, trying to find reassurance in their cadence, but the meaning had shifted. In labor, we serve. In service, we endure. But endurance had a limit. When that limit was reached, adjustment occurred. I left the plaza and returned to the upper levels, ascending through passages that felt simultaneously too narrow and too vast. My quarters seemed smaller when I entered, the walls pressing inward. I lit a prayer candle and knelt before the devotional alcove, but the words would not come. I remained kneeling in silence, staring at the brass aquila, trying to reconcile what I had seen with what I had been taught. The Emperor's mercy transforms loss into service. The collapsed worker had not been lost. He had been collected. The flesh that fails him still nourishes his armies. Failure was being defined in real time, through measurements I did not control. From death, sustenance. Death was not required, only absence. I extinguished the candle and lay on my cot. The ration block continued digesting, its warmth spreading through my limbs. I wondered how many times I had consumed identical blocks over the past 7 years. I wondered whose labor had sustained me. I wondered if it mattered. Sleep came eventually, thin and fractured, filled with dreams of teeth gleaming under lumen strips and distribution lines that never ended. The 3rd hour arrived with the shift chime. I dressed quickly, secured my data slate and verification stylus, and made my way toward processing sub-level theta. The descent took 30 minutes, passing through sections of the station I had never entered. The air grew colder as I descended, the lumen strips more widely spaced, casting long shadows across passages that curved downward at angles that suggested I was moving toward the station's core. Sub-level Theta's entrance was marked by a reinforced pressure door guarded by 4 enforcers wearing full void gear, their rebreather units hissing softly. They scanned my identification chip 3 times before granting access, the door grinding open to reveal a passage lined with pipes that dripped condensation onto the metal floor. Horvath waited 20 meters inside, standing beside a rail that overlooked a vast chamber below. He nodded as I approached. "Your observation assignment begins with intake documentation," he said. "Follow procedure exactly. Do not speak unless necessary. Record what you see without interpretation." The chamber below was easily 200 meters across, its ceiling lost in shadow. Conveyor systems crisscrossed the space, carrying cargo containers toward processing stations where servitors worked with methodical precision. The smell rising from below was chemical and organic, sharp enough to sting my nostrils. Machinery hummed at frequencies that made my teeth ache. "Intake arrives through the tertiary transit system," Horvath said, gesturing toward a tunnel entrance on the chamber's far side. "Subjects are catalogued, tagged, and prepared for processing. Your role is to verify tag accuracy against intake manifests. Discrepancies halt the line until resolution." Subjects. Not cadavers, not remains. Subjects implied something still living. A transport vehicle emerged from the tunnel, a flatbed hauler carrying approximately 50 individuals seated on benches. They wore grey coveralls identical to those I had seen in Habring Epsilon. Their hands were secured to the benches with plasteel cuffs. None of them struggled. Their faces held expressions of profound emptiness, gazes fixed on nothing. The vehicle descended a ramp into the chamber below, stopping beside a staging platform where robed medici orderlies waited. The orderlies moved along the benches, scanning each individual's identification chip and making notations on data slates. The process was swift and silent. When the scanning was complete, the orderlies unlocked the cuffs and guided the individuals off the vehicle, forming them into a loose line that led toward a decontamination archway. "Population adjustment cohort from Habring Delta," Horvath said. "Productivity threshold failures. 7 days of supplemental labor assignment demonstrated insufficient recovery. Reclassification approved by Subsector Command under Efficiency Mandate 73B. I watched the line move through the decontamination archway, each individual passing beneath chemical spray nozzles that coated them in pale blue antiseptic. They emerged on the other side, slick and dripping, guided by servitors toward a chamber labeled Preparation Stage 1. "They are still alive," I said. Horvath glanced at me. His expression did not change. "Processing requires biological viability to maximize yield. Post-mortem decay reduces nutritional content by 37%. Immediate processing maintains optimal caloric density." The line continued moving. I counted 53 individuals, all of them walking under their own power, all of them silent. The preparation chamber door sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss. "Your verification task begins now," Horvath said, handing me a data slate. "Cross-reference intake manifest against tag scans. Confirm numerical accuracy." I took the slate. The manifest listed 53 entries, each one containing an identification number, age, previous work assignment, and the reason for reclassification. I began verifying the data against the scans logged during intake. The numbers matched perfectly. 53 individuals, ages ranging from 22 to 59, all listed as productivity threshold failures. The manifest included projected yield 2,120 nutrient blocks, assuming optimal processing efficiency. "Verification complete," I said. Horvath made a notation on his own slate. "Preparation duration is 4 hours. You will observe each stage to ensure procedural compliance. Preparation stage 1 involved sedation. Through observation windows set into the chamber's upper walls, I watched as orderlies administered injections to each individual, the syringes delivering clear fluid that caused immediate muscle relaxation. The subjects collapsed onto padded tables arranged in rows. Their breathing slowed but remained visible. Vital monitors attached to their wrists displayed steady heartbeats, flickering green lights confirming continued life. Stage 2 was hygienic processing. The subjects were stripped of their coveralls, their bodies washed with high-pressure chemical sprays that removed all hair, dirt, and surface contaminants. The runoff drained through grates in the floor, carrying away everything unnecessary. The cleaned bodies gleamed under harsh lumen lights, pale and uniform. Stage 3 involved cataloging. Medicae servitors equipped with scanning augmetics measured each body, recording weight, bone density, muscle mass, and organ viability. The data was compiled into final yield projections, each projection appearing on overhead displays that showed expected caloric output per individual. The largest subject, a male estimated at 112 kilograms, was projected to yield 57 blocks. The smallest, a female at 43 kilograms, would yield 19 blocks. The projections accounted for processing loss, skeletal removal, and non-nutritive tissue elimination. Stage 4 was invasive preparation. I stopped watching the observation windows. The sounds were sufficient: the whir of medical saws, the hiss of chemical injectors, the steady rhythm of servo-assisted surgical tools. Horvath remained beside me, his attention fixed on his data slate, making notations as each step was completed. After 90 minutes, the preparation chamber's exit door opened. Servitors wheeled 53 gurneys through the doorway, each gurney carrying a body wrapped in sterile sheeting. The bodies were transferred to a secondary conveyor system that carried them toward the processing vats, massive cylinders 20 meters tall filled with dissolution chemicals heated to precise temperatures. "Dissolution takes 6 hours, Horvath said. "The chemical process breaks down organic material into base proteins, which are then filtered, fortified, compressed, and molded into standard blocks. Waste material, bone, enamel, synthetic implants, is separated and repurposed through secondary systems." The gurneys reached the vat loading station. Servitors lifted each wrapped body and placed it into input chutes that fed directly into the vats. The chutes sealed automatically, preventing contamination. Overhead displays showed vat capacity increasing with each addition. 53 bodies, 2,120 blocks. The mathematics was precise. "Your observation report will note any deviations from standard procedure," Horvath said. "Were any observed?" I reviewed the data slate. Every step had been completed according to protocol. Sedation administered correctly, hygienic processing thorough, cataloging accurate. Invasive preparation executed with surgical precision. The transfer to dissolution was mechanically flawless. "No deviations," I said. Horvath made a final notation. "Acceptable. Your next observation assignment occurs in 3 days. Report to this location at the 3rd hour." He departed without additional comment, leaving me alone at the observation rail. Below, the servitors continued their work, cleaning the preparation chambers, resetting equipment, preparing for the next intake cohort. The vats hummed steadily, their contents churning with controlled violence. I remained at the rail for another hour, watching the dissolution process through monitoring screens that displayed chemical composition readings and yield progression. The bodies dissolved slowly, their structures breaking down into constituent elements that were then separated and refined. Proteins collected in filtration tanks, lipids were extracted and diverted to fuel production, calcium was powdered for fortification additives. Nothing was wasted. By the 9th hour, the first batch of nutrient blocks emerged from the molding systems, each block stamped with production codes and wrapped in wax paper. The blocks moved along conveyors toward packaging stations where they were sorted by caloric density and prepared for distribution. I descended to the packaging level and observed the process up close. The blocks were indistinguishable from those I had consumed throughout my service. The same gray-brown color, the same dense texture, the same faintly metallic smell. A packaging servitor offered me a block still warm from the molding process. I accepted it, unwrapped the wax paper, and examined the surface. Smooth, uniform, unmarked except for the production stamp. I bit into it. The taste was iron and salt. The texture required chewing. Particles stuck between my teeth. I swallowed and finished the block, standing in the packaging chamber as servitors moved past me with mechanical efficiency. The warmth spread through my stomach, sustaining me, converting the calories I had just ingested into energy my body would use to complete the day's remaining duties. The block had come from the dissolution vat. The vat had contained 53 bodies. The bodies had been living people 6 hours ago, standing in Habring Delta, failing to meet productivity thresholds I had never been informed of. I had eaten a portion of them. The realization was not dramatic. It arrived as simple fact, devoid of emotional weight, like recognizing that a machine functioned exactly as designed. The system worked. Efficiency was maintained. The Emperor's armies would be fed. I disposed of the wax paper and departed the sublevel, ascending through passages that returned me to the administrative sections. My shift was complete. I returned to my quarters, lit a prayer candle, and knelt before the devotional alcove. The prayer of gratitude emerged automatically, but the words felt alien in my mouth, as though I were speaking a language I no longer understood. I finished the prayer and extinguished the candle. Sleep did not come. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, my stomach digesting the block, my mind processing the observation, my body sustained by matter that had been human hours before. The doctrine was correct. Nothing was wasted. The flesh that failed still nourished, from sacrifice, continuation. But sacrifice implied choice. The people I had observed had not chosen. They had been selected, processed, and consumed without consultation. Their consent was irrelevant. Their identities were erased through chemical dissolution. Their utility persisted only as calories, distributed across the subsector to feed those still deemed productive. The tooth gleamed in my memory, a fragment that had survived processing through error or oversight. Evidence of insufficient dissolution, proof that the system, while efficient, was not perfect. But near perfection was still functional. The blocks sustained, the Imperium endured, the war continued. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing into the calming rhythm. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. The warmth in my stomach persisted. I woke at the 5th hour to the shift chime. The morning routine proceeded automatically. Ablutions, dressing, prayer. I consumed a ration block from my personal supply, the taste now carrying associations I could not suppress. Iron and salt, chemical bitterness, the texture requiring effort. I reported to the Nutri-Scriptor division offices and resumed allocation work. The calculations demanded focus but not interpretation. Numbers flowed across the data slate, projections and distributions forming patterns I understood without conscious effort. 14 subsector garrisons required resupply within the next standard month. 3 Crusade fleets awaited deployment and needed full nutritional loading. The figures aligned precisely with expected demand. At midday, Adept Quartus Renning summoned me to his desk. He reviewed my morning work without comment, then handed me a sealed data cylinder. This contains intake projections for the next quarter. You will verify the figures against current population data and expected mortality rates. The task requires access to primary census archives. The census archives were located 3 sections away, maintained by a separate division that tracked all station personnel. Access was restricted to senior administrators and required special authorization. Renning provided a temporary clearance code, valid for 6 hours. I took the cylinder and proceeded to the census archive chamber, a vast space filled with rows of data stacks and cogitator terminals. The chamber was nearly empty, occupied only by 3 other scribes working at distant terminals. I selected an isolated terminal, inserted the data cylinder, and entered the clearance code. The cylinder contained intake projections for processing sublevel theta covering the next 3 standard months. The numbers were staggering. 8,700 individuals classified for population adjustment across all Habrings. The projections broke down by Habring, age cohort, and productivity classification. Each line item listed expected yield in processed blocks. I accessed the primary census database and began cross-referencing the projections against current population figures. Habring Delta currently housed 47,000 individuals. The projection allocated 2,300 from that ring for adjustment. Hab Ring Epsilon housed 52,000 and allocated 1,900. The pattern continued across all 6 lower Hab rings. The total station population would decrease by 8,700 over 3 months. But the census data showed no corresponding decrease in total population. Birth rates were insufficient to offset such losses. Immigration from subsector worlds was minimal due to ongoing military operations. I accessed historical census data, tracing population figures back 5 years. The numbers remained stable at 800,000, with variance no greater than 3% across any quarterly period. But the intake projections I was verifying suggested sustained population reduction. Unless the population was being actively maintained through replacement, I queried the census database for immigration records over the past 18 months. 73,000 individuals had arrived at the station from subsector worlds, classified as labor transfers or refugee placements. Most arrivals were assigned to lower Hab rings, where productivity thresholds were enforced most stringently. The pattern clarified. New arrivals replaced those adjusted. The station's total population remained constant while the composition continuously rotated. People arrived, worked until they failed to meet thresholds, were processed into nutrient blocks, and were replaced by new arrivals who began the cycle again. The system was self-sustaining, feeding itself through managed population replacement. The Imperium's logistical networks brought people to the station for labor, extracted maximum productivity, then converted remaining biomass into nutritional resources distributed back across the Imperium. Nothing was wasted. Not labor, not flesh, not death. I verified the intake projections against the census data and logged compliance. The figures aligned within acceptable margins. The projections were accurate. 8,700 individuals would enter processing over the next 3 months, yielding approximately 348,000 nutrient blocks. I removed the data cylinder, cleared my terminal access, and returned to the Nutri-Scripter division offices. Renning accepted the verified cylinder without comment, filed it in his secure drawer, and dismissed me to continue afternoon allocations. The work continued. Figures flowed. Distributions were calculated. I completed my shift at the prescribed hour and departed. But instead of returning to my quarters, I descended once more toward Habring Epsilon. The need to see the people was irrational but overwhelming. I needed to confirm that they were still there, still moving, still alive within the system that would eventually consume them. The communal plaza was crowded, hundreds of workers gathered around distribution kiosks and voxcasters. I positioned myself near a structural pillar and observed. The distribution line moved with steady efficiency. Each worker received their ration block, scanned their chip, departed. The cycle maintained itself through constant participation. A new group entered the plaza from a transit passage, freshly arrived based on the cleanness of their coveralls and the relative alertness in their expressions. They joined the distribution line without hesitation, integrating into the existing flow. Behind them, enforcers sealed the transit passage and moved on to other duties. I recognized the arrival pattern. These were labor transfers from elsewhere in the subsector, brought to the station to fill vacancies created by recent adjustments. They would work for months or perhaps years, their productivity measured against thresholds they had never been told existed. When they failed those thresholds, they would be selected, processed, and replaced by others identical to themselves. The inevitability was architectural. The system required no malice, no cruelty, only consistent application of efficiency standards. Those who met thresholds continued. Those who failed were converted. The station endured through perpetual rotation. I watched a young woman, perhaps 25 standard years, receive her ration block and step away from the distribution line. She unwrapped the block with practiced efficiency and bit into it, chewing slowly, her expression neutral. She had no awareness that the block in her hands might contain portions of the person who had stood in this plaza weeks ago, consuming an identical block, performing the same function. The cycle was closed perfectly. The adjusted became the adjuster's sustenance, maintaining the population that would eventually be adjusted in turn. I left the plaza and returned to the upper levels. My quarters felt smaller each time I entered. I lit a prayer candle, but could not kneel. The brass aquila seemed to stare down with indifference, its talons gripping the scroll that proclaimed nil perditum. Nothing lost. Except identity, except choice, except the boundary between living and consumed. I extinguished the candle and lay on my cot. The ration block I had eaten that morning continued sustaining me. Its calories powering thoughts I increasingly lacked the framework to contain. 3 days passed before my next observation assignment. The interval was filled with routine allocation work, calculations that demanded precision without interpretation. But the knowledge I had gained shadowed every task. Each ration distribution I calculated represented individuals who had been processed. Each intake notification I verified confirmed another cohort entering the system. At the 3rd hour on the appointed day, I returned to processing sublevel Theta. Horvath met me at the observation rail as before, handing me a data slate with the day's intake manifest. Hab Ring Gamma cohort, he said. 117 individuals, mixed age ranges, productivity threshold failures, and medical unsuitability determinations. Medical unsuitability was another term I had not encountered in my scripter training. I queried the slate's glossary function. The definition appeared: individuals whose physiological condition renders them incapable of sustained labor, but whose nutritional viability remains adequate for processing. The injured, the chronically ill, those who could no longer work but still possessed bodies capable of yielding calories. The intake vehicle arrived, larger than the previous one, carrying the cohort on benches arranged in 3 rows. The individuals displayed visible signs of physical deterioration: bandaged limbs, pronounced skeletal structure from malnourishment, skin lesions indicating inadequate medical treatment. Several required assistance to disembark from the vehicle. The cataloging process proceeded identically to before: chips scanned, data logged, tags applied. The cohort moved through the decontamination archway, emerged coated in antiseptic, and entered preparation stage 1. I verified the manifest against scan data: 117 entries, ages 19 to 64, projected yield 4,680 blocks. Horvath made his notation: preparation duration is 5 hours for this cohort due to increased medical intervention requirements. Stage 2 will include supplemental hygienic processing to address contamination risks. I observed Stage 1 through the windows. The sedation proceeded more slowly, requiring multiple injections for individuals whose metabolic rates had been compromised by chronic illness. One subject required 15 minutes of preparation before sedation took effect. The orderlies worked with mechanical patients, adjusting dosages until the desired state was achieved. Stage 2 expanded to include wound cleansing and lesion treatment. The chemical sprays were supplemented by manual intervention, orderlies using surgical tools to remove necrotic tissue and infected material before final washing. The runoff drains accumulated more biological waste than during the previous observation. Stage 3's cataloging revealed lower than expected yields. 17 individuals were reclassified as suboptimal after scanning revealed organ damage too extensive to process efficiently. These were diverted to a secondary line for alternative utilization servo skull manufacture or biologis research specimens. The remaining 100 moved through stage 4 and into dissolution. The vats accepted them with mechanical indifference, the chemical processes breaking down weakened flesh as efficiently as healthy tissue. But the dissolution took longer. The monitoring screens showed extended processing times, chemical composition fluctuations that required servitor adjustment. Damaged organs complicated the filtration process. Contaminated tissue required additional purification cycles. After 8 hours, the first batch of blocks emerged. The yield was lower than projected, 4,112 blocks instead of 4,680. The variance was logged as acceptable, falling within established tolerance ranges. I descended to the packaging level and observed the sorting process. The blocks from this cohort were marked with specialized codes indicating supplemental fortification requirements due to reduced nutritional density. These blocks would be distributed to lower priority recipients, penal legions, labor conscripts, populations deemed expendable enough to accept substandard nutrition. A servitor offered me a block. I declined. Horvath noticed. "Consumption is recommended," he said. "Observational duties require sustained energy. Refusal indicates potential psychological unsuitability for continued assignment." The statement carried no threat, only clinical observation. But the implication was clear. Refusal marked me as potentially requiring adjustment. I accepted the block. The taste was more bitter than previous samples, the texture coarser. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow, feeling the particles stick between my teeth. The block was still warm, recently molded, carrying heat that spread through my hands as I held it. I thought about the 17 individuals diverted to servo skull manufacture. Their brains would be extracted, lobotomized, and installed in floating skull drones that served the station's administrative functions. One of those skulls might eventually monitor my work, hovering over my shoulder, its empty eye sockets tracking my stylus movements. The block finished. I disposed of the wrapper and remained on the packaging level until my shift concluded. Horvath departed without additional comment, satisfied with my compliance. I returned to my quarters and did not light a prayer candle. The devotional alcove remained dark. I sat on my cot, staring at the brass aquila, trying to calculate how long I had before my own productivity measurements would determine my classification. 7 years of service, excellent verification accuracy, no disciplinary incidents, but those metrics meant nothing if I began demonstrating psychological unsuitability, refusal, hesitation, questioning. The system protected itself by monitoring those who operated it. My observation assignments were not developmental opportunities, they were tests. Each stage revealed more of the mechanism, forcing me to confront the reality of what I verified daily. Those who accepted the reality demonstrated suitability. Those who rejected it were adjusted. Horvath's calm demeanor made sense now. He had passed these tests years ago. His acceptance was complete, integrated into his identity so thoroughly that he no longer experienced conflict. He saw bodies enter dissolution and felt nothing. He consumed the resulting blocks without hesitation. He was functionally perfect for his role. I was not. My hesitation was recorded, my refusal logged, my psychological state flagged for continued observation. I lay on my cot and waited for sleep that would not come. The warmth in my stomach persisted, the block digesting slowly, sustaining me with calories derived from bodies too damaged to be useful for anything except fuel. The cycle was perfect. The system was perfect. My resistance was the only imperfection. And imperfections were adjusted. 6 weeks passed. My observation assignments continued at regular intervals, each one identical in structure, varied only in cohort composition and yield projections. I observed intakes from all 6 lower habrings, witnessing hundreds of individuals move through the preparation stages and into dissolution. The numbers accumulated in my data slates, each intake logged and verified, each yield projection confirmed against actual output. My work performance remained exemplary. I completed allocation calculations with perfect accuracy, processed intake notifications without delay, and maintained verification standards that exceeded divisional requirements. Adept Quartus Renning noted my progress in quarterly evaluations, recommending advancement to Adept Tertius status pending completion of observation training. but I had stopped consuming ration blocks from communal distribution. Instead, I requisitioned supplemental nutrient paste from Medicaid stores, claiming digestive sensitivity. The paste was synthesized from algae cultures and chemical compounds, devoid of reclaimed human matter. It tasted worse than the blocks, a thick, grainy substance that coated my throat, but I could swallow it without thinking about what it contained. Horvath noticed after the fourth consecutive observation when I declined the offered block. He made a notation on his slate, but did not comment immediately. At the sixth observation, he confronted me directly. "Your refusal pattern indicates sustained psychological resistance," he said. "This constitutes grounds for fitness evaluation." We stood on the observation rail, watching another cohort move through preparation below. 59 individuals, all classified as medical unsuitable, their bodies bearing the signatures of chronic malnutrition and untreated illness. "I am consuming alternative nutritional sources," I said. "My performance metrics demonstrate adequate energy maintenance." Horvath studied me with the same clinical detachment he applied to dissolution monitoring. "Alternative sources indicate conceptual rejection of reclamation doctrine. The Emperor's provision is through all available matter. Selective consumption suggests doctrinal deviation." "I accept the doctrine intellectually," I said. "My verification work confirms correct implementation. Personal dietary choices do not compromise operational function." Horvath entered a notation. "Intellectual acceptance without behavioral integration is insufficient for observation roles. You will be transferred back to allocation duties pending psychological evaluation." The transfer occurred within 2 shifts. I returned to my original desk in the Nutri-Scripta division offices, resuming full-time allocation work. The observation assignments ceased. My clearance for accessing processing sub-level theta was revoked. But I continued accessing the census archives, using my temporary clearance code before it expired. I traced population movements across the station, mapping arrivals against adjustments, calculating the rotation rate. The pattern was consistent. Approximately 1% of the lower Habring populations were adjusted monthly, replaced by new labor transfers within the same period. At that rate, the entire lower Hab population would be completely replaced every 8 years. No individual would remain in the labor pools beyond that duration. The station functioned as a biological filter, extracting maximum work from each arrival before converting their remaining mass into nutrition for the next wave. The implications extended beyond the station. I accessed subsector-wide census data, correlating population flows across 17 systems. The pattern replicated everywhere. Frontier worlds received labor transfers from overcrowded hive worlds. Those transfers worked until productivity failure, then were processed at local reclamation facilities. The resulting nutrient blocks were distributed back across the subsector, sustaining military operations and frontier colonies. The Imperium's nutritional supply chain was partially human-based, operating beneath official documentation through euphemistic terminology and distributed processing. Death was not required, only classification. Anyone could be reclassified at any time based on productivity metrics determined by administrators who answered to efficiency mandates set centuries ago. I was part of that system. My allocation calculations determined how many blocks each garrison received. My intake verifications confirmed the raw materials entering processing. My signatures authorized shipments that contained portions of thousands of processed humans. The knowledge was complete. The horror was total. But the system continued regardless of my understanding. At the 10th week, I received notification of my mandatory psychological evaluation. The summons arrived during morning shift, delivered by a Medicaid servitor that handed me a sealed parchment stamped with the Departamento Monitorum seal. The evaluation was scheduled for the following day, to be conducted by Magos psychologist Ven in the station's Medicaid annex. Attendance was mandatory. Failure to attend would result in immediate reclassification as medical unsuitable. The threat was explicit: refuse evaluation, become adjusted. I reported to the Medicaid annex at the appointed hour. The facility was located in the station's mid-levels, a sterile complex of examination chambers and surgical suites. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and machine oil. Servitors moved past me carrying medical equipment, their augmetic limbs clicking against the floor. Magos psychologist Ven occupied an office barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. He was more machine than human, his organic components limited to a heavily modified head and portions of his torso. His remaining structure was mechanical, servo-assisted limbs and data interface ports that connected directly to the cogitator terminal on his desk. Nutri-scriptor designation ZX447 Theta, he said, his voice emerging from a Vox unit embedded in his throat. Sit. I sat. The chair was uncomfortable, designed to prevent relaxation. Ven accessed my personnel file on his terminal, scanning through data with mechanical efficiency. Your observation performance indicates conceptual resistance to reclamation implementation. This resistance manifests as dietary modification and hesitation during processing observation. Explain. I understand the doctrine intellectually, I said. I accept its logical necessity within imperial supply structures. My dietary choices are personal and do not compromise operational function. Personal choice is irrelevant, Ven said. Operational integration requires behavioral and conceptual alignment. Divergence indicates incomplete internalization of purpose. He activated a servo skull that hovered beside his desk, its eye sockets glowing with scanner light. The skull circled me slowly, taking readings I could not interpret. You have consumed reclaimed human matter for 7 years without resistance, Ven continued. Sudden dietary modification suggests recent psychological deterioration. Identify the trigger event. I considered lying, claiming digestive sensitivity, minor illness, anything that would deflect from the actual reason. But Ven's scanner skull was equipped with stress detection augmetics. Lies would be identified immediately. The observation assignments revealed mechanisms I had not previously understood, I said. The knowledge altered my perception of nutritional sources. Knowledge is not deterioration, Ven said. Knowledge is operational necessity. All Nutri-scriptors undergo observation training to ensure comprehensive understanding of supply chain mechanics. Most demonstrate successful integration. You have not. Explain the specific barrier to integration. The subjects are still alive during processing, I said. Death is not required, only reclassification. Ven's mechanical components whirred softly as he processed my statement. Correct. Post-mortem processing reduces yield efficiency. Immediate processing maximizes nutritional extraction. This fact is documented in operational protocols you have accessed repeatedly throughout your service. Your recent resistance suggests the information was cognitively available but not behaviorally integrated. The observation assignments attempted to correct this divergence. You have rejected correction. I have not rejected the system, I said. I continue performing my duties with maximum efficiency. My verification accuracy remains perfect. Performance is insufficient evidence of integration, Ven said. The Imperium requires not merely obedience but acceptance. You obey while maintaining internal resistance. This state is unstable and deteriorates operational reliability over extended periods. The servo skull completed its scan and returned to hover beside Ven's desk. He reviewed the data on his terminal, making notations with a mechadendrite that emerged from his torso. Your stress markers indicate sustained psychological conflict, Ven said. Your cognitive patterns demonstrate active suppression of doctrinal alignment. This condition is categorized as Stage 2 operational dissonance. Treatment options are limited. He turned the terminal screen toward me. The display showed a treatment protocol flowchart. Stage 2. Operational dissonance had 3 recommended interventions: intensive doctrinal re-education, chemical adjustment therapy, or partial memory redaction. Re-education requires 3 months of dedicated instruction and has a 62% success rate, Ven said. Chemical adjustment produces faster results, but introduces behavioral unpredictability. Memory redaction eliminates the psychological conflict permanently by removing awareness of specific trigger information. I stared at the flowchart, following the decision paths. Each intervention led to one of three outcomes: successful integration, continued observation, or reclassification as unsuitable. What happens if I decline all interventions? I asked. Declination is not permitted, Venn said. Untreated stage 2, dissonance progresses to stage 3 within 3 to 6 months. Stage 3 subjects are incapable of reliable duty performance and are automatically reclassified as productivity failures. The classification was equivalent to adjustment. If I refused treatment, I would be processed within months. I select memory redaction, I said. Venn made a notation. Redaction will target observational experiences related to processing operations while preserving functional knowledge necessary for allocation duties. The procedure requires 4 hours under sedation. Cognitive function returns within 24 hours. Minor disorientation persists for 3 to 5 days. He handed me a consent form printed on parchment, accompanied by a stylus. The form was brief, stating I understood the procedure, accepted the risks, and confirmed voluntary participation. The language was identical to forms I had signed authorizing nutrient block shipments. I signed. Venn accepted the form and filed it in his terminal. Report to Surgical Suite 7 in 1 hour. Preparation protocols will be administered by Medicae staff. The Emperor protects through correction. The Emperor protects, I repeated automatically. I left his office and proceeded to Surgical Suite 7. The suite was small and sterile, dominated by a surgical table equipped with restraint systems and monitoring equipment. A Medicae orderly directed me to remove my robes and lie on the table. The restraints secured my wrists, ankles, and forehead, preventing movement. The monitoring equipment attached to my chest and temples, measuring vital signs and neural activity. The orderly administered a sedative injection, explaining that unconsciousness would occur within minutes. I stared at the ceiling as the sedative began taking effect. The lumen strips blurred, their light expanding into halos. My thoughts slowed, becoming viscous and disconnected. I tried to hold on to specific memories: the tooth in the ration block, the observation of living people entering dissolution, the census data revealing perpetual population rotation, but the memories became abstract, losing sensory detail, fading into pure information devoid of emotional weight. The last thing I remembered was the servo skull hovering above my face, its scanner light pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I woke in a recovery chamber, 26 hours later, according to the chronometer on the wall. My head ached with dull pressure concentrated behind my eyes. My thoughts felt fragmented, concepts present but disconnected from experience. I knew I had undergone a medical procedure but could not recall why. A Medicae orderly entered, checked my vital signs, and administered a hydration injection. Cognitive function will stabilize within 3 days, she said. Resume light duties tomorrow. Full duty assignment resumes in 5 days. I nodded. The gesture made my headache worse. She departed. I remained in the recovery chamber for another 6 hours, sleeping intermittently, my dreams formless and grey. When I was cleared for departure, I returned to my quarters and lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling until the shift chime marked the next day's beginning. The return to duty felt both familiar and alien. I understood my role, remembered my training, recalled the procedures for processing allocation calculations. But specific memories were absent. I knew I had undergone observation training, but could not remember what I had observed. I knew I had accessed census data, but could not recall why. The gaps were clean, no ragged edges, no sense of loss. The information was simply absent, replaced by smooth continuity that suggested nothing had ever been there. I resumed allocation work without incident. The calculations flowed naturally. Intake notifications were processed with appropriate efficiency. Adept Quartus Renning reviewed my work and noted satisfactory performance recovery. But something had changed. When I consumed ration blocks from communal distribution, the taste registered as nutritional sustenance without additional associations. The iron and salt flavors were simply flavors. The fibrous texture was simply texture. I felt no resistance, no discomfort, no sense that the block contained anything other than sanctioned nutrients. The doctrine made sense again. Nothing was wasted. All matter returned to service. The Emperor provided through reclamation and redistribution. The system was efficient, necessary, and correct. I believed because believing required no effort. 3 months after the procedure, I was promoted to Adept Tertius, assigned expanded allocation responsibilities including direct coordination with Crusade Fleet Logistics divisions. The work required 12-hour shifts and access to classification levels I had not previously been cleared for. During one allocation session, I processed a requisition from Crusade Fleet Obsidian requesting 4 million nutrient blocks for a 3-year pacification campaign in the Kalor sector. The requisition included supplemental requests for specific processing parameters, indicating the Fleet Command preferred blocks with higher protein density derived from subjects aged 25 to 40. I cross-referenced the request against current inventory and determined that fulfillment would require increasing intake rates across multiple stations. I filed priority notifications to 7 stations, including Bastion Station Tertius Majoris, recommending productivity threshold adjustments to meet demand. The notifications were approved within 48 hours. Intake rates increased by 18% across the affected stations. The Crusade fleet received its full allocation on schedule. 2 weeks later, I observed distribution statistics indicating successful deployment. The fleet's nutritional reserves sustained operations through multiple compliance actions, contributing to the pacification of 6 contested worlds. Casualty rates among Imperial forces were lower than projected due to consistent caloric intake maintaining troop readiness. The success validated the system. Efficiency worked. The Emperor's will was served through proper resource allocation. I consumed a ration block during my evening meal, sitting in the communal dining hall reserved for administrative personnel. The block tasted exactly as expected. I chewed thoroughly, swallowed, and felt the warmth spread through my chest. Nourishment, sustainability, purpose fulfilled through consumption. Across the hall, other scribes and adepts consumed their own rations, engaging in quiet conversation about duty assignments and efficiency metrics. We were functionaries serving the Imperium's vast logistical apparatus, our individual significance negligible but our collective function critical. I understood my place within the system. The knowledge was comfortable, providing structure and meaning. The alternative resistance, questioning, psychological dissonance led only to correction or reclassification. Acceptance was survival, compliance was purpose. The tooth no longer gleamed in my memory. The observation chambers were forgotten. The census patterns were irrelevant. I knew in abstract terms that humans were processed into nutritional resources, but the knowledge carried no weight, no emotional resonance. It was simply operational fact, as mundane as knowing that Promethium-fueled vehicles or that ammunition required metal casings. The system endured, I endured within it. The distinction between those concepts was unnecessary. Years passed, my service continued. Promotions arrived regularly, each one expanding my responsibilities and access levels. At 14 years of service, I was appointed to Adept Secundus, overseeing nutritional supply coordination for an entire subsector. At 19 years, I advanced to Adept Primus, managing fleet-scale logistics for 3 simultaneous Crusade deployments. The work consumed my existence completely. I lived in my office, sleeping 3 hours per night, consuming nutrient blocks at my desk, maintaining constant communication with dozens of subordinate stations and facilities. The numbers grew larger, millions of blocks, billions of calories, entire populations converted and distributed across the Imperium's endless wars. I signed authorizations that determined life and death for thousands, though I never thought of it in those terms. I signed forms, I verified figures, I ensured efficiency. The people represented by those figures were abstractions, relevant only as sources of nutritional yield. At 23 years of service, I was summoned to a meeting with Subsector Command, a gathering of senior Munitorum officials responsible for coordinating all logistical operations across 17 systems. The meeting occurred aboard a command vessel in high orbit above Bastion Station Tertius Majoris. The command vessel's conference chamber was vast, dominated by a central table surrounded by high-backed chairs. 30 officials attended, each one representing a different logistical division. I represented nutritional supply. The meeting's purpose was planning for a sector-wide compliance operation projected to last 15 years. The operation would require sustained nutritional support for 12 million Imperial Guard troops, 400 Astartes, and supporting personnel. Preliminary estimates suggested a need for 9 billion nutrient blocks over the campaign duration. The senior supply coordinator, a withered man named Karshan who had served for 60 years, presented the challenge. Current reclamation capacity across all sub-sector facilities cannot produce 9 billion blocks within the campaign timeframe without significant intake rate increases. We must either expand processing infrastructure or increase intake efficiency through revised classification standards. Infrastructure expansion required 5 years minimum, and resources currently allocated to other priorities. Classification revision could be implemented immediately through administrative mandate. What revision parameters are proposed? Asked the senior logistics adept, a woman whose augmetic jaw clicked softly as she spoke. Karshen displayed a data slate showing proposed threshold adjustments. Current productivity requirements classify individuals as surplus after sustained performance below 78% of baseline metrics. We propose reducing the threshold to 65%. Additionally, medical unsuitability classifications would expand to include chronic conditions currently treated through basic Medicaid intervention. The changes would increase intake rates by approximately 32% across the subsector, sufficient to meet campaign nutritional requirements. Objections? Karshan asked. None were raised. The officials understood the necessity. The campaign required fuel. Humans were the most abundant fuel source available. Implementation begins immediately. Karshan said, Adept Primus. Coordinate threshold updates across all stations and facilities. Ensure processing capacity is optimized for increased volume. I acknowledged the order. The meeting continued, addressing ammunition supplies, void ship maintenance schedules, and communication infrastructure upgrades. My attention remained focused on calculating revised intake projections, determining which stations required capacity upgrades, and identifying potential bottlenecks in the supply chain. The compliance operation would consume more humans than any previous campaign in the subsector's history. But the operation was necessary to secure Imperial control over contested space. The humans processed would still serve the Emperor, their bodies converted into sustenance that would enable victory. The logic was unassailable. The mathematics worked perfectly. I returned to my office and began implementing the directive. Within 3 days, threshold updates were distributed across all subsector facilities. Within 2 weeks, intake rates increased according to projections. Within 1 month, nutritional block production exceeded previous records. The system adapted seamlessly. The Imperium endured. The campaign would be fed. At 31 years of service, my productivity metrics began declining. The endless calculations, the constant coordination, the decades of 12-hour shifts had eroded my cognitive efficiency. I made mistakes, minor calculation errors, filing delays, misplaced authorizations. None were critical failures, but the pattern was clear. I was approaching my own threshold. I requested medical evaluation, hoping for chemical stimulants or neural enhancement to restore performance. The evaluation concluded I was experiencing natural cognitive decline due to sustained operational stress. Treatment options were limited and unlikely to restore full function. The Medicaid adept, A different one from Magos Psychologis Ven, who had retired years ago, presented me with classification options. Your service record is exemplary. You have contributed significantly to subsector nutritional operations. However, continued decline will compromise reliability. We recommend reassignment to lower intensity duties or voluntary retirement with full honors. Retirement meant returning to civilian population pools where productivity thresholds would still apply. My cognitive decline would classify me as medical unsuitable within months. The alternative was already clear. Reassignment will only delay the inevitable, I said. I understand operational requirements. The Medicae adept nodded. Your understanding is noted and appreciated. Self-recognition of unsuitability demonstrates proper internalization of imperial values. You may elect immediate processing or continued service until classification becomes mandatory. Both options preserve your contribution to the Emperor's work. I chose immediate processing. The decision required no deliberation. I had spent 3 decades ensuring efficient nutritional supply for the Imperium's wars. My final contribution would be direct rather than administrative. The processing occurred 2 days later. I reported to processing sub-level theta at the prescribed hour, carrying no personal effects except my scriptor robes. A junior adept, perhaps 25 years old, met me at the entrance and escorted me to the intake staging area. The area was familiar despite my memory redaction. Some fragment of experience must have survived, buried beneath the smooth continuity the procedure had created. I recognized the layout, the smell of chemicals, the sound of machinery humming in the distance. You will be processed with today's Habring Beta cohort, the junior adept said. Total count 73. Expected yield 2,920 blocks. I was just another unit in the count. My identity would be logged, my mass calculated, my yield projected. Then I would enter the dissolution vats, my structure broken down into base proteins, filtered, fortified, and molded into blocks that would feed soldiers I would never meet. The cohort arrived 30 minutes later, herded from the intake vehicle by servitors. They moved with the resigned emptiness I remembered from my observation years, faces blank, movements mechanical. I joined the line, feeling neither fear nor resistance. This was correct. This was necessary. The cataloging process was brief, chip scanned, tag applied, data logged. I was Adept Primus designation CX992 Alpha, 31 years service, projected yield 147 blocks accounting for reduced mass from age and stress. The line moved through the decontamination archway. The chemical spray was cold, stripping away the outer layer of grime and sweat. I emerged on the other side feeling cleaner than I had in years. Preparation stage 1 began immediately. The sedation injection was administered by a Medicae orderly I did not recognize. The fluid was cold entering my bloodstream, then spreading warmth through my limbs. My muscles relaxed, my thoughts slowed. I was guided to a padded table and lay down. Above me, the ceiling was grey plasteel marked with stains that might have been chemical residue or something else. A servo skull hovered past, its scanner light briefly washing over my face. The sedative deepened. My awareness became fragmented, sensations isolated from each other. I heard the hum of machinery. I felt the restraints securing my limbs. I smelled the sharp chemical odor of Stage 2 preparations beginning elsewhere in the chamber. My last coherent thought was numerical, 147 blocks, each block 4,000 calories, 588,000 calories total. Enough to sustain 6 soldiers for 10 days. Enough to contribute to some small victory in some distant campaign. The contribution was sufficient. The Emperor was served. Consciousness faded into chemical darkness, and I felt nothing after. The dissolution vats accepted my body along with the rest of the cohort. The chemicals worked as designed, breaking down organic structure into component nutrients. The filtering systems separated proteins from waste. The fortification processes added synthesized vitamins. The molding equipment compressed the mixture into uniform blocks. 147 blocks emerged, stamped with production codes and wrapped in wax paper. They were indistinguishable from the millions of other blocks produced across the subsector that day. They were loaded into cargo coffins, sealed with purity chains, blessed by adepts who had never met me, and shipped to destinations determined by allocation calculations performed by functionaries who filled the role I once occupied. The blocks sustained. The soldiers who consumed them felt warmth spread through their bodies, energy returning to limbs exhausted by combat. They offered prayers of gratitude for the Emperor's provision, unaware that the provision came from 31 years of service converted into 147 portions of nourishment. The system functioned perfectly. Nothing was wasted. The Imperium endured, and somewhere in the vast archives of Bastion Station Tertius Majoris, a data file recorded my service, my contributions, my final classification, and my yield. The file would persist for centuries, eventually corrupted by age and neglect, the specific details lost to time while the system that processed me continued without interruption. The station remained in orbit, processing thousands every month, maintaining the subsector's nutritional supply chain through perpetual population rotation. New arrivals replaced those adjusted. New scribes filled vacant desks. New adepts signed authorizations identical to those I once signed. The cycle was perfect, the mathematics unassailable, the doctrine absolute. In his name, nothing was wasted. In his service, all matter returned. From flesh to sustenance, from loss to continuation, the Emperor provided through obedience. The prayer was true. The system was true. The horror was true. And truth required no meaning beyond function. The Imperium endured.